Oh, moo.
Welcome to The Know. I'm Ashley Jenkins.
I'm Mica Burton.
It's another edition of Overblown Controversy Day here on The Know. This time, there's something happening between a couple of portions of the game developers and the video games media. You may be seeing it on social media a lot. It's coming up more and more and more as people get confused and wonder what it's all about. So we want to talk about it a little bit. Called The Culling for short, is the talk of certain segments of the industry today, and no, it has nothing to do with some post-apocalyptic H1Z1 type video game, but it's actually over some imagined beef between video game developers and journalists. So there we go.
Now, we've got game devs making fun of journalists lashing out at each other, and it all started with Horizon Zero Dawn and a little-known game development technique.
Little tiny.
Well, it's little known if you're not a game developer, which is sort of how this whole silly controversy actually started.
So, what prompted all of this weird back and forth between a small portion of game developers and some video game websites?
Well, it all started with a Kotaku post about Horizon Zero Dawn. Guerrilla Games recently released a documentary about the game's development, and Kotaku writer Jason Schreier used one interesting GIF from the documentary in particular as a launching point for discussion.
The post, titled Horizon Zero Dawn uses all sorts of clever tricks to look so good, showed how Horizon Zero Dawn uses a technique called Frustum Culling, which is essentially a tool developers use to save system resources when rendering game assets.
View Frustum Culling, in layman's terms, is just a technique that keeps the focus of a game's rendering on whatever the player is viewing directly, because rendering everything the player isn't seeing is a waste of resources, which would make the game run less efficiently.
Now, the article's tone was interpreted by some others as depicting this technique as this really cool thing being achieved in Horizon Zero Dawn that had never been done before, but it's actually been around for a really long time, like decades long time, and it's used in just about every video game ever, and is a basic part of video game development. So, naturally, a handful of developers had a laugh at the article's expense.
One developer jokingly tweeted that Kotaku doesn't know how games are made, and another similarly tweeted that, instead of actually rendering a human person on the screen, the game composes models out of thousands of tiny triangles.
It's okay, fine, it's funny, it's a cool thing,
right.
But yeah, it's really not new. However, some people had more than a laugh, because a few indie developers felt like this was a AAA game getting some free publicity for something that literally every video game does. Several developers expressed their frustrations about exactly that.
But isn't that the mixed bag of indie development versus AAA development? Fairly or not, AAA games get more coverage than everybody else because that's what gets the eyeballs, even if they're not doing anything particularly interesting or new.
Right. Anyway, none of that was that big of a deal, which is why it was kind of surprising when all of a sudden pops up an article from Polygon reporting on a few developers making Twitter jokes like it was the start of this crazy controversy, framing it as game developers mocking Kotaku and calling it a bad look for all developers.
In the article, Polygon referred to the whole thing as a controversy, and then mocked developers back for their jokes about Kotaku's piece. And that didn't sit well with some of the original developers. Four Circle director Dan Pierce tweeted that it was simply a conversation between him and a colleague and not at all meant to mock players.
Now, Polygon since updated that article to make a couple of changes. For one, they softened the title a little bit to developers don't mock people for being amazed by game dev techniques. They also removed the identity of the developers from the post in order to keep them from getting too much unnecessary heat on Twitter.
Oh, but the damage was already done, and now the original writer, Kotaku's Jason Schreier, has reacted to that post. Schreier wrote on Twitter, "Fuck this article for A, conjuring drama out of nowhere, and B, Polygon not having the courtesy to reach out to me."
Schreier took a bit more than 140 characters to air his frustrations on NeoGAF, saying, 30 minutes ago, I had no idea that there was any sort of kerfuffle involving my Horizon article. Then I saw a Polygon article about how developers are mocking my work based on 4 tweets by people I've never seen before.
He went on to say, "The tweets don't bother me that much since, as I wrote in my original article and comments, I was using Horizon's documentary as a springboard to talk about common graphical tricks and techniques. I don't really care if those people didn't pick up on that. What bothers me is Polygon making it seem like this is some sort of widespread phenomenon."
So when you combine all of that, Frustum Culling is now turning into a topic on game dev Twitter, much to the confusion of quite a few gamers out there, understandably.
There have been some thoughtful comments on the dust-up. Simon Roth, developer of the indie game Mica, has offered to bring games media to Oxford to give them a presentation about how modern 3D engines work.
Which would be a cool opportunity because it's a lot of things that we hear about engines all the time, but not a lot of people outside game development have a really, really good idea how they work. Then, of course, there were some joking things coming up, people mocking typing Frustum Culling into Clash album names, referring to Frustum Culling as their favorite Twilight vampire, their favorite sex moves. So, thanks, Twitter.
So really, a lot of this is making Mount Everest out of a very, very small molehill, and it's sort of a combination of indie developers expressing frustration about a lack of coverage for some of their games, plus the distrust of games media for writing fluff PR pieces all rolled into one. And somehow it all sparked up over something as innocuous as a post about looking underneath the hood of one of this year's most popular games.
Unfortunately for some of the smaller indie devs who are struggling to get anyone to pay attention to their game, it's part of the nature of the business. Those big AAA titles, they get eyeballs, and so naturally they're gonna get a little bit more coverage because media, games media, and that includes us, have to keep the doors open and the lights on, and that's typically done by getting a lot of people to watch your stuff. I mean, if we only ran stories on the Know about games with tiny audiences, not as many people would watch, and then nobody would watch because it'd be gone, and then we would all be homeless. So there's a balance to be struck there, right? Yeah. I understand the struggle. Every now and again, there'll be an indie breakout hit, I consider Stardew Valley to be one of those. It seems like it came out of nowhere, developed by like a single dude, and it got all this coverage. But for every Stardew Valley or Undertale, there are thousands of indie games that go more or less unnoticed, and that sucks for the indie developers who spent all that time on it. But blaming games media for using AAA titles to bring in the views is maybe not the right way to get attention onto your game.
No, but it makes sense on that side of things that games media tends to latch on to AAA titles for a jumping off point to start the discussion.
Right.
And really, that's all the original article was doing. Schreier has also linked on Twitter to a number of other times in the past when Kotaku has covered game development techniques in an easy to understand manner to help connect audiences with the nitty-gritty of game development.
Right, make it a little bit more accessible.
Exactly.
Although, to be fair, those examples also, for the most part, come from AAA games. So it may not exactly address the problems that some of the smaller developers had in the first place, but it's not exactly unprecedented.
Baby steps. And on the other side of this, some of the developers out there also feel that the games media should be able to do their research and understand more about the industry they're covering, which is a totally fair point.
Right, but it's also asking a little bit much to expect players and non-developers to know all the ins and outs of these techniques, which is why it's cool when they're suddenly interested in them. And that really was the original point of the Polygon piece, which kind of got buried with the more inflammatory stuff.
It's also worth pointing out that if you want people to be more understanding of things like bugs, timelines, early access, etc., then this is the kind of education that's good for everybody, and it fosters a better environment for gamers and development in general. Being more open about it could also help inspire young people interested in game development to actually pursue it as a career as well, which is what's cool about some of the other thoughtful commentary we're seeing out there.
So the whole big TLDR of it all is that game development's pretty cool. Sometimes gamers are interested in the tricks of the trade. Sometimes people start shit where there's not actually really any shit to be starting.
Just another day in video games.
Pretty much. I mean, you have to figure it's a pretty, we're in a reasonably decent place if this is the kind of crazy shit that happens.
Exactly.
What do you guys think of the non-traversy over Horizon Zero Dawn and its techniques of Frustum Culling? Let us know in the comments. And have you ever heard of Frustum Culling before today?
I sure haven't. But for future updates on the culling, remember to like this video, and if you're new around here, subscribe to the Know.
Yes.
I had to say it like that. The culling is in all caps.
For one, it's hard to track you.
Four Circle Director Dan Pierce, got it. Sort of widespread phenomenon.
So you combine all that, Frustum Culling is now turning into the topic, into a topic on game dev.